Hey, it's Joshua, your cultural Catholic, coming at you on this Wednesday with another International Wednesday. There's a little bit of good news mixed with a lot of bad news today. So, quick little rundown of today's uh, stories. The first will be about Brazilian former president Luis Inacio Lula da Silva and his conviction. Uh, Iraq liberating Mosul. I know it's a little old, bear with me. A giant iceberg appearing off the coast of Antarctica, and tobacco in Africa. Now, first, a start off with the Brazilian former president. Al Jazeera reported today that Brazil's former president, Luis Inacio Lula da Silva, has been convicted and sentenced to 9 years and 6 months in prison for corruption and money laundering. So, a little bit of background on this. Lula da Silva was a very popular president in the early 2000s. From 2003 to 2010, he was actually president during that time in Brazil. He's very popular, fairly left-leaning. In America, he'd be branded as socialist. And this kind of started the entire issue in Brazil that led to Dilma Rousseff stepping down as president, actually being impeached and kicked out, and with a lot of shakeups in the government. He has been accused of taking bribes during or after during his presidency. And part of the allegations is that Lula received, quote, a luxury seaside apartment as a bribe from one of Brazil's biggest construction companies, OAS, and that he illegally received $1.1 million. Now, this is kind of funny because the new president, Michel Temer, is also battling bribery charges. And so this seems like a giant mess down in Brazil. There are theories that this is actual legitimate corruption. There are theories that this may be Michel Temer, who's more conservative, using and other big money interests taking over Brazil. I don't know what it is. All I know is Lula da Silva may or may not have taken bribes and got a lot of contracts for OAS and Petrobras, which is the partially state-owned gas company. And that led to his successor Dilma Rousseff being impeached and removed from office, and Michel Temer taking control. And Temer is also fairly corrupt, so this could just be a giant corruption-y mess that's going on. But we'll just see how this turns out and go from there. Now, the next story is obviously the liberation of Mosul from Daesh, also known as the Islamic State, by the Iraqi government. Bloomberg on July 9th writes, quote, Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi traveled to Mosul to declare it liberated from Islamic State 3 years after the city's abrupt fall to the jihadists alerted the world to the group's growing strength, territorial ambitions, and barbarity. So a little bit of background. Back in 2014, Daesh steamrolled across the border from Syria into Iraq and took a huge swath of the country, and actually there were fears that they would go all the way to Baghdad and conquer Baghdad. And since there's a bit of a sectarian and ethnic divide, there are three different groups: the Sunni Arabs, the Shia Arabs, and the Kurds, or their ethnic group onto themselves, living in Iraq. And there were fears that there would be massive bloodshed led by Daesh against the Shia moderate Sunnis and the Kurds. At the time, the Iraqi army was not doing their job in holding back Daesh, but the Kurdish Peshmerga ended up being probably actually ended up being the most effective fighting force against Daesh. However, over the intervening 3 years, the Iraqi security forces improved. There were also various militias set up, mostly supported by Iran, which is a kind of a weird thing because in Iraq, we're on the same side as Iran, whereas in Syria, we're on opposite sides because we don't like Bashar al-Assad, and they do, and in Iraq, we both hate Daesh, so this is a good thing. A few bad things are going to be associated, and I'll get into most of the bad things that are associated with this liberation, but the big one that I'm going to talk about is there could be an increase in terrorist attacks. This has been seen quite frequently with Daesh. A lot of the big attacks last year in Europe were in response to Daesh losing territory, because the offensive to liberate Mosul started in March, and as time progressed and they lost territory, they committed more and more terrorist attacks in Europe. One in particular being the attack on Paris, and it's a pattern that they have, is that when they lose territory, they do terrorist attacks to kind of say, hey, we still have power. We may be losing territory, but we still have power. Fear us. And actually, the White House issued a statement. Quote, today, Iraqi security forces supported by the United States and the global coalition liberated the city of Mosul from its long-time nightmare under the rule of ISIS. We congratulate Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, the Iraqi security forces, and all Iraqis for their victory over terrorists who are the enemies of all civilized people. We mourn the thousands of Iraqis brutally killed by ISIS and the millions of Iraqis who suffered at the hands of ISIS. We grieve with the Iraqi people for the loss of the heroic soldiers and Peshmerga who gave their lives to restore life to their country, and we honor their sacrifice. We in the United States and global coalition are proud to stand with the Iraqi security forces and all those who made this moment of liberation possible. Now here comes the very Trumpian sounding part. We have made tremendous progress against ISIS, more in the past 6 months than in the years since ISIS became a major threat. The victory in Mosul, a city where ISIS once proclaimed its so-called caliphate, signals that its days in Iraq and Syria are numbered. We will continue to seek total destruction of ISIS. Now, I'm going to have a few issues with this statement. First, they really went all out with ISIS. Again, that is what they want to be called. I prefer to not call them that, which is why I use the term Daesh, which again is a acronym of their name in Arabic, and apparently it means shit. So we're just gonna go with that. Now, the first two paragraphs are fine; they're very normal. The last one, it's a little false. So the Mosul offensive, which led to the liberation of Mosul, actually started in March of last year, and so it was set up by the Obama administration. And actually, up to September 2016, when they were at the outskirts of Mosul, that was all under Obama, and he really set up the apparatus to get this all going. The battle for Mosul itself did not start until October. Now, granted, the bulk of the campaign, because it went from October to obviously a few days ago, and was thus, I will admit, most of it did occur during the Trump presidency. Again, this apparatus that was set up that Trump has taken credit for using, which again, I will give him credit that he used it. He didn't set up. It was all set up under the Obama administration, under a coalition. Um, so again, he can claim credit for being the guy around, but he can't really claim credit for doing more to degrade ISIS or Daesh, my apologies, in the last 6 months, because a good portion of the degradation happened last year under Obama. Now, there are a few issues going on overall with the liberation of Mosul. So Amnesty International reported that there were a lot of rights abuses in the liberation of Mosul. Granted, obviously by Daesh, they used people as human shields. They mined the crap out of the roads. They did horrible things. Not going to deny that. But there also didn't seem to be a lot of care taken when taking into account civilians. And there were still thousands upon thousands of people living in Mosul at the time, during the liberation, and there wasn't really a lot of care taken into account to make sure that they minimized civilian casualties. Now, again, I admit it's not going to be perfect, but Amnesty International reports that quote, the coalition strikes may have killed as many as 5,805 civilians in West Mosul alone during its campaign. So that could easily be 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 civilians killed. Now I'm just guessing here, but that is a possibility with the largest city, one of the largest cities in Iraq, and one of the largest cities that Daesh had control of. So once we won't really know how many people died because of these strikes. Additionally, there were also rights abuses done by the Iraqi security forces. There were detentions, and a lot of people were accused of being part of Daesh, even though the likelihood that it was may not be accurate, and this could stem a lot of resentment and could lead to more people joining organizations like Daesh. And actually, in a piece by James Polis of The Week, written today, kind of points out that this liberation is kind of not as positive as we'd like to think, because Mosul's a ruin. The mosque that, for instance, the mosque that al-Baghdadi proclaimed his caliphate, where was it? Where was it? Anyways, the Great Mosque of Al-Nuri is basically destroyed. Now that, I will give you, was done by Daesh, but they also destroyed, and they destroyed a lot of things, but the coalition destroyed the crap out of Mosul. It's basically a bunch of ruins. Even the old city, which is probably one of the oldest cities in the world, that still has people living in it. And it could, as Polis points out, could lead to more extremism, and just keep going with this cycle that we've been going on the last 16 years. So it's great that Mosul was liberated, but we do need to see how things play out after and how they continue to play out. Now, even more in bad news, the BBC reports today that, quote, one of the largest icebergs ever recorded has just broken away from Antarctica. The giant block is estimated to cover an area of roughly 6,000 square kilometers. So that, in American terms, is about the size of Delaware. Um, that is not good. Now, this came off of Larsen C ice shelf, which is one of the large large ice shelves that are in the water. So it's not really going to change how much water is in there, and it's kind of part of the ebb and flow of the size of glaciers. Kind of in that it helps balance out the weight. But there are two big issues that come from it. One, if this gets away from Antarctica and starts to go up towards shipping lanes, that could cause huge issues in international trade. So that's something that is being closely monitored. Additionally, and there's some divide on scientists, this could be a sign of climate change because it's getting harder, warmer. Stuff is starting to melt faster in the Arctic and Antarctic. So that's something that really does need to be monitored, and scientists, God bless them, they won't know until they test, and let them test. I want them to confirm whether or not this is related to climate change. If it's just part of how ice sheets go, that's how it, and they determine it that way, that's great. But I do want to know, it would be great to know whether or not this is climate change. I personally think it might be, but I am not a scientist, and I will defer to their judgment. And in this case, it's a pretty even divide between among scientists. And finally, there is an article in the Guardian published today that is talking about how the tobacco industry is trying to crush various laws in sub-Saharan Africa that are trying to protect people. John Oliver actually did a very interesting piece on this, I think last year or 2 years ago, referencing Togo. And what's going on is that African countries are trying to create tougher laws to make sure that tobacco isn't sold to children, has plain packaging to kind of increase the awareness of what smoking can do to you. And tobacco companies are trying to fight it. And they may have a little bit more success because these are developing countries. These countries are much poorer than places like Australia, the United States, where smoking is starting to go way down. And it is actually predicted, because of the patchwork enforcement of some health treaty initiatives associated with smoking, and that this could be a growth market for smoking. For instance, it's very common in Africa for cigarettes to be sold by a single stick, and that it's sold along pathways with candy and sugary treats and things like that, along routes that children go on to go to school. And that there is it's a common practice in many countries for tobacco companies to intimidate with use of politicians' own constituents, politicians to go against legislation to regulate tobacco, or to even get politicians out of office. And other things that they're using is they're saying that it's breaking international law, trade treaties, things like that. Even though Australia won a case dealing with plain packaging and how it will harm international trade and go against international trade treaties, and nothing has happened. except lowered smoking rates. So we'll see how things go there. It is, again, a big issue. This is Josh Rosella, your cultural Catholic, signing off.